morning. It's what a great day. It's good to be here. Thank you guys all so much. It's always good to be together. Yesterday we had a women's gathering here for a bunch of women. I was here. I was actually sitting up in the balcony because my daughter was one of the people, the ladies who would be speaking. Her and my mother-in-law shared together. It was just really sweet to hear. She's 22. She's out of college. Has a real job and all this kind of things. And yesterday, after they were over, I got to go, my oldest daughter, my youngest daughter, and then her baby, my grandbaby, Lennon. We all got to go to brunch together, just the four of us. And I was it's just real like kind of emotional, nostalgic, just like this, just cherishing this like really sweet time with my girls. And I began to think about being a parent. I remember one of the coolest things about being a parent was getting to tell your kids what to do. I don't know if you remember this, right? When they got old enough to like start to listen, you get to tell them what to do. And I remember thinking this very specifically, that as someone who follows Jesus, who holds the scriptures to be authoritative, God has commanded children to obey their parents. So I'm like, this is a great thing, right? That means my kids have to do what I tell them to do because God has kind of commanded it to be that way. But it also means that I have to pay really close attention to what I'm asking my kids to do if I'm speaking on behalf of God, right? Do you see how this works? And so we give our kids all kinds of commands, and sometimes we'll make up rules just to make sure that they do the things that we want them to do. And what gets lost in parenthood is why you asked your kids to do something in the first place, right? Because at some point in time, it just becomes, I just need you to do this so I don't lose my mind. And that has to be enough. And as your kids, you don't understand it, you're trying to figure it out, but you will, one day. But one of the things that's really interesting, whenever I would tell my kids to do something when they were younger, I would say, hey, I need you to do this. And then they didn't do it. The question that I would ask them is, did you hear me? Did you hear me? Why am I asking that? Because what you're assuming is that if you heard what I said, then you would have done it. You would have cooperated or obeyed or some version of that. So we asked them, did you hear me? What you're going to see today is a lot of this language. You've already seen it over the last few weeks where Jesus would say, whoever comes into the light, right? Whoever lives by the truth comes into the light. You'll hear this language about listening and hearing and responding, and it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. And I want us to get to this idea where you understand why it is that you need to learn how to recognize and to hear God's voice and to be willing to do what it is that He's asking of us. Why is that important? What is He actually trying to do in this when He says, did you hear me? And what our response to that is. So we're talking about this kind of journey through John. Today we'll be in John chapter 10 again. We've looked at Jesus being the light, Jesus being a gate, Jesus being a shepherd. We'll continue that today. But he made these pointed statements, and part of this is the way John is constructed, the Gospel of John is constructed, is he uses this idea of how Jesus would be in conversations or sometimes confronted by religious leaders and others, and he would use these statements to say, this is who I am. He's revealing himself to those people, and I think through that, he's revealing himself to us. And particularly one of the most important places, we looked at this every week, is when the Pharisees are confronting him and they're talking about, Abraham is our father, and Jesus makes this statement that before Abraham was, I am. And it's a direct reference to how God revealed himself to Moses in Exodus 3 when he says, I am that I am. When he reveals his name to him. And Jesus is essentially saying, I am God. And what I'm trying to get us to understand the implications of that and how we think about this, because a lot of us have grown up, especially if you grew up like I did, where the Bible was used as a way to kind of prove points. You would grab a nugget of truth, a fact, and you would use it to sling at someone in an argument to say, this is why this is true. One of the most common ones is Jesus the only way to heaven. And so everybody would say, oh, let's find this verse, and then we would proof text. We'd yank out John 14:6 and say, here's the verse that proves that there's one way to heaven when you die. We're using this idea of truth or a true thing to prove something to be correct or right. And what John 14:6 actually says is this. When Jesus says to them, he said, we don't know how you're going. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father but through me. One of the things when I talk about this, people always will email me or catch me after the service. They'll ask you, say, Mike, are you saying there's more than one way? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's a very big difference between how do you get into heaven when you die and what it looks like to be reconciled to the relationship for which you've been created. Right? It's the difference between, like, if you go to, what do I need to do on this test in order to get a C? What's the minimum requirement to get in? Versus, would you go to your surgeon and say, hey man, how'd you approach God? I just tried to get a C, man, whatever I need to do to get a C. Do you let this person operate on you? No, you want them to know stuff. You want them to know stuff. Right? I don't want them going, how much do I need to get a C to figure out how to do the surgery? I'm like, no, I want you to know how to do the surgery really, 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 really well. Like, it's that difference. How do you get into heaven when you die versus how do you live in a relationship for which you've been created for? And in fact, what this has is it's not just a proof text, right? It's not a proof text, it has a context. And what it says is this: I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you'll what? You'll know my Father as well. If you have, from now on you know him and you have seen him. Why? Because Jesus is God. Like, what I'm trying to get us to understand is to start to think about this. What are the implications of how God reveals himself to us as the way, the truth, and the life? And particularly today, as I think about this, I want us to think about how Jesus reveals himself and says, I am the truth. That's what he says, I am the truth. Does it just mean that he gives you a bunch of facts to win all your political arguments or your apologetic arguments or whatever it is that you're arguing about? Does he just give you facts to prove those things, or is there something else that pushes on us and challenges us? That's what I want us to look at today. So the last couple weeks we've been looking at this from John chapter 10, and last we looked at Jesus as being the gate. And if you remember, I drew this clever little picture last week. I've kind of cleaned it up, so I have to do it again today. But what we learned was that Jesus actually, he is the gate, right? He is the gate. And we observed last week there are two things that are required, because this whole idea that Jesus says is he's leading his people out, and we'll see this again this morning, he's leading people out of the pen and into a place where they'll find pasture. And there's two things that Jesus says that are required, two things that from this illustration that are required for sheep to get out of the pen and out into pasture. And number one was the gate, and number two was the shepherd. And Jesus comes along last week and he says, I am the gate. And today we'll notice what he says in John chapter 10, starting in verse 11. He says this, that I am the good shepherd. So he's both of these things. Again, that was last week's talk. If you want to go back and listen to that, you can find that. But he says, I am the good shepherd. And then what does he say next? The good shepherd does what? Lays down his life for his sheep. So you're going to start to notice what we're trying to do when we look at this, and when I read the scriptures, what I want to try to do is to sort of observe, say, what am I noticing? What am I seeing? And then what does this say? What does God say to us through this? What's revealed to us? The hired hand is not the shepherd, and he does not own the sheep. So when he sees a wolf coming, he takes off and he abandons them and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. But the man runs away because he is a hired hand. And it's really interesting that he adds this idea here, he doesn't care. There's something about him that is more concerned with his own well-being than that of what he's been entrusted to, with getting his own way and preserving his own life than with this other. Cares nothing about the sheep. And then Jesus says again, I am the good shepherd. My sheep know, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And he connects here this idea of knowing with caring. There's a relational idea that starts to develop. So last week we looked at this. He leads us out of the sheep, right? He summarizes. And what he says is that when we come out of this pasture, out of this place, out of this pen, in this, what we find is two things. Number one is we find salvation, that we will be saved. Whoever enters through me, Jesus said, will be saved. And number two is they will find pasture. And what I mentioned last week was that most of us have a picture of what it means to be saved. And you immediately think pearly gates and St. Peter standing there and asking you some question. And if I said, what image do you have of fine pasture? You're like, I don't really have one. Green grass, land, what is it? And so then what our minds go to is like angel wings and streets of gold, and we're just fluttering around. And what we're going to see, this is not actually how God reveals to us what this is going to be like for us, what he's doing in the world. He's leading us out in order to find salvation. And he's leading us out to do something. He's to bring us out of these pens. To bring us out of these pens. And we talked this last week, what are these pens? So we're going to keep reading. I want to look at this because he says, if we pick up in verse 14, I am the good shepherd, right? I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. So he's pulling us into this relationship, to this way of life that he's describing here. Then here it is again. I do what? I lay down my life for my sheep. Where is this coming from? Like when you're reading the Bible, you're like, where is this coming from? Sheep, take them out and let them feed them and do these things. And then he's saying, no, the shepherd lays his life down for his sheep. And then he goes on, this is what we looked at last week a little bit. He said, I have other sheep that are not of this pen, and I must bring them in also. And actually he says, I must bring them also. I must bring them out of their pens and into this place. He's not leading us out of one pen into another pen. He's leading us out of our pens and into fine pasture. It's a really, really important thing for us to understand, because what a lot of us do in our arguments is we pick a way of life, a philosophy, and sometimes it's defined by a political position or category. Sometimes and what we think is that we're trying to get people out of other pens and into our pens. And what Jesus is saying, you all have to get out of your pen. That's what he's doing. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice. And here's why. There'll be what? One flock and one shepherd. He is talking about our capacity to over-identify with things. He's bringing us out of the places where we over-identify. And I mentioned some last week. We have all kinds of categories. But there are some people who you over-identify with your struggles, right? Whatever we over-identify, he's leading us out of those places and to keep us from identifying with anything other, to fully identifying with anything other than as those who belong to God in this place. Until we learn how to live in a place where there's one flock underneath one shepherd. That's the goal. And then we come again. The reason I know that my Father loves me, is that I lay down my life, and here it is again. It just keeps popping up. Only to do what? You can read it out loud. Only to right. What is he talking about? Any guesses? Easter's coming up. Big hint. The resurrection. This is where this is driving. This is what I love about John. John is giving us this. So Jesus is telling this story about sheep and shepherds and pens and gates. And he says, I'm the gate and I'm the shepherd. And then he gets in, and then all of a sudden he starts saying the reason that my Father, and I don't have time to get into the reason why, that's a whole different thing. But basically what he says is, this next part is so important. He says what? No one takes it from me. Nobody takes the life of the shepherd. But instead what? I lay it down of my own accord. And then I love this. He says, I have the authority to lay it down. I have the authority to take it back up again. This is so critical for us to understand. Because what you're going to see is Jesus ends up before Pilate. If you know the story, I've been spending a lot of time. I've glossed over half of each of the Gospels is about the arrest, trials, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. 50% of every gospel is about, that's like you have all these stories and teachings of Jesus. Halfway, all of them turn the corner and go to the arrest, the trials, the crucifixion, the resurrection of Jesus. Half of them. And that's most of what we read about Jesus. And what you see is they come to him, they arrest him in the garden, they bring him before the high priest. And the high priests are like, we want to get him killed, but we don't have the authority to kill him because we're a puppet. We operate underneath Rome, and only Rome has the capacity to crucify someone, to execute someone. So we're going to send them to Pilate. Pilate's like the puppet governor of this area, of this region. He operates under Rome, and he's there to do Caesar's bidding, mostly to keep the Jews in check and to keep peace, make sure nothing gets chaotic. This is why insurrections were so quickly squelched, because whenever someone raised up against Rome, they just killed them all. So we don't need anybody messing around here. We need to keep the peace, and the peace comes by doing what we say. Do you hear me, right? That's how it works. And so Jesus ends up before Pilate. And the high priests are going, we need you to hear this. He's like, I don't care anything about this. Like, am I a Jew? Do I care who your king is? No, I don't. Like, y'all take care of this stuff. We don't have the capacity to crucify him, and we want him dead. And now Pilate has to get involved. And so Pilate begins to interrogate Jesus. And he begins to ask him some questions. And he says, are you a king of the Jews, right? And Jesus says back to him, is this your own idea? Or did someone else say this to you? So Jesus is standing before Pilate. Pilate is the one who's going to pronounce him guilty or innocent. And he's like, do you think I'm a king, or did someone tell you this? And then Pilate's like, look, I just want you out of my hair. Can you just give me something I can go with? And then can you tell what you've done? And here's what Jesus says in John 18. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, what would happen? We would run ads and destroy people with our words. And if that doesn't work, with our money, right? Do you see what's happening here? How often do we get rolled into a kingdom that we don't belong to? If my kingdom were this world, we would operate the way everybody else does. That's what Jesus is saying. They would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. They would not allow this to happen. But who lays their life down? Who has the authority to lay it down? Jesus. Nobody is doing this to Jesus. To prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but my kingdom is from another place. And then Pilate says, you are a king then? And then Jesus says, you say that I'm a king. Those are your words, not mine. Like, don't you love this? And then you see this. In fact, the reason that I was born, here it is. This is why Jesus showed up. And I came into the world is to do what? To testify the truth. The word, the better word, is to bear witness. And we're going to look at this over the next little bit. Because the reason I came into the world, Jesus says, is to testify the truth. Everyone who's on the side of the truth, and we'll get here, but does what? Here it is. Listens. And then what does Pilate say? What is truth? This is so good, because this is where a lot of us have this picture. If you've seen movies, this is right, Pilate goes back and he washes his hands, he does all this stuff. What is happening to him? What is really important for us to start to think about is, what does Pilate do when he is confronted with the truth? Jesus says, I come to bear witness of the truth. And Pilate's like, what is truth? And what is he asking for? He's asking for some information that will be correct or right, that he can use to go and weigh this out in the court of law with all these other people. And you know what he does? What he begins to do is he goes back inside and he wrestles them. He goes to the leaders and he comes up with an idea. He says, you know what? I think I know what we can do. Every year they release a prisoner at Passover. I know what I'll do. I'll bring the dude that they love the most. Most of us have this idea that Jesus Barabbas, that was his name. You've heard of Barabbas? His name was Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, son of the Father. We have this idea that he's like this, he's like Ted Bundy, right? That nobody likes him. That is not true. Jesus Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He could rally the Jewish people to revolt against Rome and overthrow the government that they did not want, which is exactly what they all wanted. That's why he's in jail. That's why he's been arrested, why they're going to crucify him. Because he was a threat to the Roman government, and the Jewish people probably loved him. And so here he comes, and he says, I know what I'll do. I'll let them pick one, and surely they'll pick this innocent man. So they put him up there, and it's basically two ways of doing things. Jesus, Barabbas, who gets the work done by rallying the troops and waging war. And Jesus, the Son of God, who's going to give his life as a ransom for many. And he puts them up, both of them, and says, you can choose one, and they start choosing, release Barabbas. And he says, well, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And they say, crucify him, right? And Pilate is a Roman. He's Greek. I mean, he's Roman. And he knows the emperors, and they knew the sons of God. They know these Roman deities and all this. So he's getting nervous about being involved. He does not want to be involved in this. You see Pilate trying to find a way out. So he has Jesus basically flogged and beaten, and they just demand crucifixion. And so this is what happens in John chapter 19. They want Jesus crucified. And the crowds are demanding. In John chapter 19, verse 8, it says this, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Now he's in the middle of something that he does not want to be in the middle of, and now things are coming unraveled. And when he went back in the palace, he looks at Jesus, he says, where did you come from? And Jesus gives no answer. Jesus gives no answer. He just stands there doing what? He's bearing witness of the truth. Pilate wants information, he wants facts, and he is confronted with a reality that he cannot shake. And he's doing everything he can to get out from underneath it. Have you ever done this? Right? How do you respond when you collide with something that you can't control, you can't coerce, you can't get it to do something different? What do? We resort to all kinds of things, and Jesus is just letting this truth press against these two realities. He's just letting the reality of God and his kingdom just weigh against his own will and his own way and his own intentions and his own desires. This is what Jesus as the truth does to us. And what Pilate finally does, he breaks. And what does he say? Don't you realize that I have the power to either free you or to crucify? And there you have the truth. That's what Pilate believes. This is not a confession. This is simply a statement of what Pilate believes to be true. I have the power to do what I want to do right now. That's what happens when we were squeezed and we're pressed. It's the fact that he cannot coerce or force Jesus to do something that he wants him to do. Notice, Jesus doesn't defend. He just bears witness. No one takes my life from me, but I'll lay it down on my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. So here's what the truth does. It does two things. Number one is the truth exposes this illusion. In our world, and this is just the way the world works, we live under the illusion that we have the power to make things right by proving our arguments to be correct. And all of us have done this. If someone just saw the facts as they were, surely they'd be different. Surely things would be right. If we just all believed the right things about the right things, then the world would be as it should. And so we find truth to be useful to us in making our case for being right. This is actually, there's a passage in 1 Corinthians 15. It's always, death, oh death, where's your victory? Where's your sting? We always hear this at funerals. And the next line it says, the power of sin is the law. The power of sin gets its fuel by us trying to use something that's to bear witness to us, on us, and reshape us from one reality into another. And we try to use it to preserve our own way. And truth is not a tool to be used for right arguments, but rather it exposes this illusion and then invites us to encounter something. The truth of Jesus and the cross, I want to say this very carefully. The truth of Jesus and what's about to happen to him on the cross exposes the inevitable descent towards separation and then division. And then the use of coercion and manipulation to defend those divisions, to use facts to get our way, thinking that we're brokering the truth. And the futility of this way in this world will always lead to an escalating frustration, and it will ultimately result in violence. This is the way of the world. Pilate said, "Don't you know that I have the power?" And we may not use violence, but we use power, and we use money, and we use influence, and we do all kinds of things to force our way or to preserve it. And all the while, there's a truth that stands. And here's the thing I want you to understand. Number one, the truth is that you've been made by God and for God. That is a fundamental, foundational truth. And because of that, what it stands to reason is that you will never find the life that you were looking for. The truth that you will not find the life that you were looking for apart from a life with God. And you're likely to stand and to resist and to do all kinds of things, to say, no. If I do this, will you do that? We're trying to coerce or use or get God to do something on our terms. We do all kinds of things to wash our hands, to present other options, to keep ourselves from having to live underneath this pressing reality. And Jesus exposes the reality that we can have the life that we most want on our terms, that we can sort of do God's will our way. An encounter with Jesus, as the truth, exposes the things that we tend to depend on. It's interesting, the word truth. It comes from the old word troth, which is where we get our word betrothed. If you ever heard it, we don't use it anymore. But my daughter's betrothed to be married, right? She's engaged, but she's betrothed. And it's a promise, but it's a truth, and it's relational. It's always relational. It's not in the way you would use it in a sentence, as you would say in the old days, I pledge my troth to you. You're promising something of yourself that does this. And this is what I mean, because what Jesus says, we'll back up. When he says, this is the reason I was born, John 18. He says, everyone who's on the side of the truth, and we think the side, meaning my side, the side that God's on. You ever thought that before? It's whoever belongs. Whoever belongs to the truth does what? Listens. The truth exposes our illusions. And the truth also makes us right. And there are two ways that it does that. Number one is you can be correct. You can arrange facts, use truth, and you can be right. And there are a lot of people who I know who have done that, and they are right in all the wrong ways, and it never works that way. Know anybody like that? Those are fun people to be around. And what we're always doing is we're always using the truth. And we're never allowing the truth to bear witness, to press on us. We're always trying to, and some of us have gotten so good. Most of the stuff that I watch where people are like destroying other people in their political arguments or their religious arguments fall in this category. But that's a shallow version of what God came to do to make you right. He did not come to make you correct. He came to make you become the way you've always been intended to be right. Remember we talked about dikaiosune? It's this depth of rightness that only comes when we allow ourselves to be exposed for who we are in light of who God is. And we trust him, and we learn to respond to him. And you can be correct, or you can be the way that you've been created to be. I am the good shepherd, and my sheep know me. So what do we do? What does this mean? All of those who belong to the truth, who learn to live in this, we do what? We listen to the truth. So here's the thing. When I would tell my kids to pick up your shoes, or to help clean up after dinner. Or I would give whatever commands I was giving, right? Thus saith the Lord through me, you are to do this. What is it that I want? I remember early on as a parent, I had to think about this because what I wanted was my house to be clean and orderly, right? And that's what you end up resorting to because it's sometimes the only thing you can figure out. But I knew that wasn't enough because if my kids grow up thinking that they need to listen to what I say in order to do what they've been asked, we're gonna miss something along the way. And what I want when I ask my kids to do something is I want them to care. Right? When you ask your kids to pick up their shoes, you're saying, can you care about things that I care about? Can you cooperate and participate to make our home a place of flourishing? Can we do this together? Isn't that what you mean? And you know what you need to do that? You don't need authority. You need trust. You need trust. And so all along the way, I remember my oldest was very small. I had to think about this because it was so tempting to go, I just need you to do what I say so I don't lose my mind, and that's enough. But what I realized, there's a bigger vision that everything that I ask them to do is to build trust. Why? Because what I want when they're 28 and 22 is to sit down at brunch and enjoy the relationship that we have. That is not built on them doing what I tell them to do. It's built on the fact that we belong and there's trust. Trust is the response to truth. And I'm not talking about using it as facts. I'm talking about letting the truth of Jesus bear witness on whatever reality you're trying to live out, live by, create, or whatever, and let him do that work in you. And there are a couple of questions that I would use to start this. Number one is, what do you trust about Christ? What do you trust about Jesus as Lord of your life? Can you trust his provision for you? Can you trust his provision, or do you constantly feel like you need to take matters into your own hands? I've played so many games with God in this, but I'm learning. It's only taken me 35, 40 years, right? I'm learning. Number two, can you trust his guidance? Can you trust that when he asks you to respond one way, when you would rather respond in another, even if you can produce facts that justify that you're right, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to coerce God into getting on your side of the truth. And he's like, I am the truth. There is no side other than me. And we come to him, we allow him to bear witness on us. To bear witness is to press against your life. And then thirdly is, can you trust his forgiveness? Or do you feel like you have to keep promising God to do better? This is what I'm talking about. A lot of us, we don't fully understand the power and the pervasive nature of God's forgiveness to make us right in the way that you want to be right. In the way that you want to be right, the way that you were made to be right. This deep sense of rightness that so pervades our lives that we end up believing that somehow everything else can possibly be returned to that, and we give our lives for it. And what you'll learn in a few weeks is we bear witness to that. We bring that to bear on the world. It's a beautiful thing. So here's for today, right? To stand before Jesus as the truth and just let him expose you for all the things that you think and feel, the realities you're trying to create, the realities you're trying to preserve, and let his reality begin to become the shaping force for yours. And there's only one question that you'll need to answer when Jesus says, do you trust me? Whoever belongs listens, right? You don't want to get to the end and say, hey, God, I did everything that you said. When he's asking you, can you trust the one who said it? That's the goal. All right, can we do that? I'm the shepherd. I'm the shepherd. I'm the gate. Everything that you need, he is. And he leads us out from these things that we build into the place in the way in which we've been created to live. Father, would you help us to hear your voice, to recognize your voice. In the smallest things, we are so accustomed to finding facts and stats and making a way to try and get you to do things the way we want them done. And you stand and you just bear witness to a reality that we are constantly being invited into. Lord, would you help us to see it and to trust it enough to walk in it? And I ask you to do this, Father. I ask you to make this so in our congregation. And I pray all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.